The rain had been falling all morning, washing the dust from the city streets and tracing faint silver lines down the window of Emily Wilson's cramped Chicago apartment. She stood at the glass coffee, forgotten in her hands, watching dark clouds gather over Lake Michigan. The television murmured in the background, meteorologists warning of an approaching storm system predicted to be the worst since last year's devastating gale. The same storm that had taken David from her when a construction site collapsed during rescue efforts. Emily's fingers tightened around the mug, the ceramic now cold against her skin. The weather map on screen showed swirling patterns of green, yellow, and red, nature's warning signals, advancing toward the shoreline. The weatherman's voice faded beneath the sound of her own heartbeat as memories surfaced David's phone call that morning, his voice tight with excitement about finishing the hospital project ahead of schedule. The sudden shift in his tone when he mentioned unusual structural movement, his promise to call back after checking the foundation support beams. A promise never kept. Behind her, bills spread across the kitchen table like fallen autumn leaves. Electric, water, medical credit card statements displaying alarming balances in bold red font. Beneath them lay the pink slip from Anderson Financial Services corporate downsizing, effective immediately with 2 weeks severance for her 7 years of dedicated service. Beside that, the eviction notice 30 days to vacate due to building conversion to luxury condominiums. The weight of it all pressed against her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Alex sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, a map of the Great Lakes spread before him, his small fingers tracing the coastlines with careful precision. At 10, he already carried himself with the quiet seriousness of someone who had seen too much change too quickly. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned forward, whispering lake names to himself like incantations. Superior, Michigan; Huron; Erie, Ontario. Learning geography had become his refuge after losing his father, as if memorizing the world might somehow make it less frightening, more controllable. Emily watched her son, her throat tightening. After David's funeral, Alex had stopped talking for nearly 3 weeks. The school counselor called it selective mutism, a response to trauma. He spoke now, but sparingly, his voice often barely above a whisper. His questions about the future had grown more frequent lately, sensing the precariousness of their situation, despite Emily's careful shielding. How do you tell a child that safety has become a luxury you can no longer afford? The knock at the door came like punctuation to her thoughts. 3 sharp raps, precise and formal. Emily wiped her palms against her jeans before turning the handle, expecting the building manager with yet another notice or complaint. Instead, she found a courier in a crisp gray uniform, holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax, the surface embossed with an unfamiliar crest. The envelope felt surprisingly heavy, the paper thick and expensive beneath her fingers. Inside, a formal letter on watermark stationery from Northlake Legal Associates in Mackinac City, Michigan. Emily's eyes caught phrases that seemed to float off the page. Regret to inform you of the passing. Arthur Reynolds, deceased, sole beneficiary, island property on Lake Huron. Requires personal inspection before transfer of deed. Her mind struggled to make connections. Arthur Reynolds. David had mentioned the name only once or twice. His grandfather, a shipbuilder, who lived somewhere in northern Michigan. A distant relative who had become estranged from the family for reasons David never fully explained. Alex appeared at her elbow, his curiosity temporarily overcoming his usual reserve. He studied the letter, his eyes widening as he processed the information. An island, a real one with trees and shores and secrets. His fingers traced the embossed letterhead, then darted to their bookshelf, pulling down an atlas to search for Lake Huron, excitement building in his movements for the first time in months. While Alex immersed himself in maps and research, Emily read the letter again, searching for hidden conditions or complications. According to the document, Arthur Reynolds had passed away 3 weeks ago at age 92, leaving his entire estate, primarily consisting of a small island with structures, to Emily as the widow of his only grandson. The property had been maintained through a trust, taxes paid for the next 5 years. The lawyer, one James Graham, requested her presence to inspect the property and complete the necessary paperwork as stipulated in Arthur's will. The request couldn't have come at a worse time, with bills mounting and job interviews scheduled. Yet something about the timing felt almost orchestrated, a life raft appearing just as the waters rose. Emily folded the letter, her practical mind already calculating costs against benefits. At minimum, property ownership could provide leverage for new loans. At best, the island might be valuable enough to sell and create a financial cushion. Either way, it offered something they desperately needed: options. That night, after tucking Alex into bed, Emily searched online for information about Arthur Reynolds. Results were surprisingly sparse for a man who had lived nearly a century. A few mentions in local northern Michigan newspapers from the 1950s and 60s about innovative boat designs. A black and white photograph of a tall, broad-shouldered man standing beside what appeared to be a partially constructed wooden vessel. A brief obituary noting his naval service during World War II and subsequent career as a master boat builder. Nothing that explained why David had spoken of him with such complexity in his voice, a mixture of admiration and unresolved hurt. Sleep came fitfully, dragging Emily into a vivid dream where she stood on an unfamiliar shoreline. Mist rose from dark waters, partially obscuring a wooden structure where an old man worked, his movements precise and deliberate as he shaped planks of cedar. He looked up, occasionally glancing over his shoulder as though sensing an unseen presence. She watched as he slid open a drawer in his workbench, placing inside what appeared to be an antique brass compass, before sealing the compartment with practiced movements. He turned then, seeming to look directly at her through the moss, his eyes the same shape and color as David's. His lips formed words she couldn't hear yet, somehow understood. Only give it to someone who can read the water. Emily woke with half the dream clinging to her consciousness like lake mist, impossible to dismiss as ordinary. The next morning, Emily called James Graham's office, her decision made. Rather than simply signing papers remotely as initially suggested, she would take Alex to see the island. The trip would use nearly all their remaining savings, but something deeper than logic pushed her forward. The same instinct that had guided her through the darkest days after David's death. When Graham seemed surprised at her decision, mentioning that previous communications from Arthur had indicated she might decline the inheritance, Emily felt a chill of recognition. Arthur had known about her, had perhaps even anticipated her response. 3 days later, Emily and Alex loaded their small Honda with essentials for the journey. The 5-hour drive north took them out of Chicago's concrete sprawl through the Michigan countryside, where forests grew denser and the air sharpened with pine scent. Alex sat quietly in the passenger seat, a folder of printouts, maps, and notes about Lake Huron's geography and wildlife spread across his lap. Occasionally, he would point to something through the window: a red-tailed hawk circling an unusual rock formation, the first glimpse of blue water in the distance. Each observation offered like a small gift. As they approached Mackinac City, the landscape transformed. The Great Lakes stretched, vast and gleaming bridges spanning impossible distances, lighthouse towers standing sentinel against the horizon. Emily felt something loosen in her chest. The scale of the water and sky made human problems seem smaller, more manageable by comparison. Even Alex seemed affected, his posture relaxing as he pressed his face against the window glass. They found James Graham's office in a well-maintained Victorian building overlooking the harbor. The lawyer, a trim man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, greeted them with formal politeness, offering coffee and cookies while explaining Arthur Reynolds's unusual stipulations regarding the inheritance. According to Graham, Arthur had rejected numerous lucrative offers for the island over the decades, most recently from Blackwell Development Corporation, a luxury resort company that had been acquiring lakefront properties throughout the region. Richard Blackwell himself had made personal appeals, offering sums that had risen to 7 figures in recent years. Arthur had remained unmoved, insisting the island would remain in family hands or not at all. Graham spread a survey map across his desk, revealing a teardrop-shaped island approximately 40 acres in size, located 3 miles offshore in Lake Huron. The property included a main boathouse, and several outbuildings, all maintained but unoccupied since Arthur's death. A trust had been established for property taxes and basic upkeep, but any significant improvements or decisions about the island's future would fall to Emily. As Graham explained the technical details, Emily noticed a slight tension in his manner when discussing Blackwell development. When she inquired directly, Graham hesitated before admitting that Richard Blackwell had already contacted his office upon learning of Arthur's death, expressing continued interest in purchasing the island. The offer remained open. Graham explained, with Blackwell emphasizing his willingness to make the transaction as painless and profitable as possible for the new owner. Emily's instinct for financial pressure points honed through years of accounting work detected something significant in Graham's careful phrasing. Blackwell wasn't simply interested in the island. He seemed determined to acquire it regardless of cost. That level of motivation typically indicated something more valuable than appeared on the surface, information worth investigating before making any decisions. After the meeting, Emily and Alex found a small diner overlooking the marina, the kind of place where nautical decorations weren't tourist affectations, but worn artifacts from actual maritime use. They sat at a window table watching fishing boats and pleasure craft navigate the harbor while waiting for their meal. Alex, revitalized by the change of scenery, had begun sketching the island based on the survey map, adding imaginative details like hidden coves and secret paths. The waitress, setting down plates of whitefish sandwiches, paused at the sight of Alex's drawing. Her weathered face softened as she recognized the outline. Sever's Island, she called it, using a name that didn't appear on any official document Graham had shown them. When Emily inquired about the name, the waitress excused herself, returning moments later with an older man wearing a captain's cap and a heavy cable-knit sweater despite the warm day. Frank Cooper introduced himself with a firm handshake, calloused fingers testifying to decades of manual craft. His eyes, sharp blue beneath bushy white brows, assessed Emily with unnerving directness before softening at the sight of Alex. Frank had known Arthur Reynolds for over 40 years. He explained, having worked alongside him in the boatyard before Arthur retreated permanently to his island. The locals had nicknamed him Seaver, partly a shorthand for his surname, partly for his severed ties to the outside world after his wife's death. Frank's voice lowered, taking on the cadence of someone sharing community history. Arthur hadn't just been any boat builder. He'd been the best in 3 counties, known for designs that balanced beauty with unmatched seaworthiness. Both wealthy collectors and working fishermen had commissioned his vessels, drawn by craftsmanship that seemed to belong to an earlier century. But 15 years ago, after some dispute with developers, Arthur had withdrawn to his island, accepting only occasional specialized restoration work. He'd become increasingly reclusive, appearing in town only for essential supplies. When Emily mentioned Blackwell development, Frank's expression hardened. Not merely developers, he clarified, predators. Blackwell had systematically acquired properties around the lake, often using questionable pressure tactics on elderly owners. Environmental corners cut building codes, sidestepped through political connections. Only Arthur had consistently refused their offers, standing as the final obstacle to Blackwell's grand vision for a resort complex that would transform the entire shoreline. Frank hesitated, seeming to measure Emily's trustworthiness before reaching into his pocket. He produced an antique brass key worn smooth with age and handling, sliding it across the table toward her. Arthur had left it with him years ago, Frank explained, with instructions to give it to whoever came looking. Not just anyone. The right person would know what to do with it. The certainty in Frank's gaze suggested he believed Emily was that person. The key felt surprisingly heavy in Emily's palm, its surface warm as though it had absorbed some essence of its former owner. When Alex asked what had opened, Frank simply smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. Some things you had to discover for yourself, he replied. That was Arthur's way. But he could help them reach the island if they were determined to go. His own boat was laid up for repairs, but he knew where Arthur kept his old rowboat docked. If the weather held, they could make the crossing before evening. Dark clouds had begun gathering on the horizon as Frank led them to a small private dock at the edge of town. A wooden rowboat painted deep blue with the name Alma carved into the stern was secured with a heavy iron padlock, the unusual type that would require the antique key now resting in Emily's pocket. Frank helped them load their overnight bags, his experienced eye approving Emily's practical clothing and sturdy boots. Weather on the lake could turn quickly, he warned. Best to reach the island and secure themselves before the storm system moved in. The boat, though clearly aged, showed signs of meticulous care. Wood-oiled and preserved brass fittings, polished seams perfectly sealed. As Alex settled onto the center bench, his hand brushed against an unusual seam in the wood. Curious, he pressed, gently revealing a hidden compartment beneath the seat. Inside lay an antique brass compass, identical to the one from Emily's dream, alongside a leather-bound logbook filled with handwritten notes and coordinates. Emily's skin prickled as Alex lifted the compass. The exact object she had seen Arthur hide in her dream, now manifesting in reality through her son's discovery. The coincidence felt too precise to dismiss, as though Arthur had orchestrated this moment from beyond death. Frank seemed unsurprised, nodding with satisfaction, before helping Emily position herself at the oars. The old boat builder had known about the compass, had perhaps expected them to find it another test passed in what increasingly felt like an elaborate evaluation. As they pushed off from the dock, Frank called after them with one final instruction: follow the compass, bearing marked in red on the dial, regardless of what their eyes or modern navigation might suggest. Lake Huron held unpredictable currents and shifting sandbars. Arthur's markings would guide them safely. The old man remained on the dock until they rounded the first point, his figure gradually diminishing against the shoreline, like something from another time, dissolving into memory. Emily rowed steadily, finding unexpected familiarity in the motion. David had taught her rowing techniques during their early dating years, summer weekends, spent on smaller lakes where he'd shared his love of water and in boats. The memory of his patient instructions guided her movements, now muscles remembering what conscious mind had forgotten. Alex studied the compass intently, offering quiet course corrections when they drifted from the marked bearing. The weather deteriorated more rapidly than predicted. Within an hour, gentle swells transformed into choppy waves, dark water splashing over the gunnels as wind speed increased. The shoreline disappeared behind curtains of rain, and the island, visible earlier as a dark smudge on the horizon, vanished completely. Emily's arms burned with exertion, doubt creeping in as the boat rocked precariously. Had she been reckless, risking their safety on some romantic notion of discovery? The practical accountant in her calculated the foolishness of their position, while maternal instincts screamed to protect Alex from danger. Alex's voice broke through her rising panic calm and certain beyond his years. The compass, he explained, had begun behaving strangely, the needle swinging in precise patterns rather than maintaining constant north orientation. He recognized it as an encoded navigational system, similar to ones he'd read about in naval history books. The compass wasn't malfunctioning. It was responding to underwater magnetic formations specific to this part of the lake. If they followed these signals exactly, Alex believed they would reach the island regardless of visibility. The theory seemed impossible, yet with conventional navigation compromised by the storm, Emily had little choice but to trust her son's insight. She adjusted course according to his instructions, fighting exhaustion as they pushed through increasingly violent waters. The boat, despite its age, handled the conditions with remarkable stability, almost as if designed specifically for navigating this crossing during inclement weather. Just as Emily's strength began failing, a dark mass materialized through the rain, jagged rocks and pine trees emerging from mist like a scene from mythology. The island appeared exactly where Alex had predicted, validating his interpretation of the compass's unusual behavior. They navigated carefully around submerged rocks that wouldn't appear on standard charts, following a narrow channel that curved gently toward a small protected cove on the island's leeward side. As the keel scraped against pebbled shore, relief flooded through Emily's trembling muscles. They had made it, through impossible navigation against reasonable judgment, guided by century-old tools and the intuition of a 10-year-old boy. Alex jumped out first, securing the boat to an iron ring embedded in shoreline rock, the practice movement suggesting he'd performed such tasks all his life rather than merely read about them. Rain pelted them as they gathered their bags and sought shelter among the trees. The island rose before them, rocky outcroppings covered with dense pine and birch forest. A narrow path, partially overgrown but still discernible, wound upward from the landing. Alex pointed to weathered wooden markers intermittently placed along the trail, small carved symbols resembling waves and stars that matched markings in the logbook they'd discovered. The path climbed steadily for nearly half a mile before opening to a clearing where a two-story wooden house stood against the elements. Built from hand-hewn timber, darkened by decades of weather, the structure seemed to grow from the island itself rather than merely rest upon it. Wide porches wrapped around both levels' windows, positioned to capture panoramic lake views from every angle. A stone chimney rose from the center like a spine, solid and unyielding against the storm winds. Unlike the abandoned property Emily had expected, the house showed signs of recent habitation. No dust covered the porch railings. No leaves had accumulated against the foundation. The brass handle on the front door gleamed dully in the fading light, recently polished. Emily hesitated before the entrance, uncertain whether to knock, a absurd instinct given that they supposedly owned the property, or simply enter. The antique key from Frank slipped perfectly into the lock, turning with surprising smoothness. The door swung inward without a sound, revealing an interior space that defied Emily's expectations. Instead of musty abandonment, they entered a meticulously maintained living area that smelled faintly of beeswax, cedar, and wood smoke. Oil lamps positioned throughout the room appeared recently trimmed, one on a central table, still radiating residual warmth, when Emily placed her palm near the glass, as though extinguished only hours before their arrival. Alex moved through the space with reverent curiosity, fingers skimming surfaces but disturbing nothing, respecting the precise order of objects. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with volumes on naval architecture, Great Lakes history, indigenous woodcraft, and environmental science. A drafting table occupied one corner, angled to catch northern light, its surface covered with precise technical drawings of boat components. On a side table near a well-worn leather armchair, Emily discovered an open journal, the ink still fresh on its final entry. The handwriting matched the logbook from the boat, strong downstrokes and distinctive capital letters. The last notation, dated just 3 weeks prior, read simply, "Everything is prepared. They will come when it's necessary." Below that, in different ink, as though added later, "Beware Blackwell. He knows about the blueprints." The warning sent a chill through Emily as she scanned the room with new awareness. What blueprints? What had Arthur known that warranted such caution? The message suggested he had anticipated not only their arrival, but also potential danger. Before she could investigate further, Alex called from the kitchen, his voice tinged with surprise. The pantry contained non-perishable supplies, canned goods, dried foods, water purification tablets, arranged with military precision and labeled with purchase dates from within the past month. Whoever had stocked these shelves had done so knowing someone would need them soon. As they continued exploring the first floor, the storm intensified, rain lashing against windows while wind howled through surrounding trees. The house remained remarkably solid, its construction seemingly impervious to elements that would challenge modern buildings. Only when they reached the rear study did Emily notice the first sign of vulnerability, a small water stain spreading across the ceiling where the roof appeared compromised. The study itself captured Emily's full attention. Its walls covered with maps of Lake Huron spanning different historical periods, each marked with notations about currents, depths, and magnetic anomalies. A glass-fronted cabinet contained navigation instruments from various eras arranged chronologically like a museum exhibit. At the center of the room stood a large oak desk, its surface organized with architectural precision. Pens and pencils, aligned by size papers, stacked at perfect right angles, a magnifying glass positioned beside what appeared to be geological survey documents. Emily approached the desk, drawn to a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image showed a younger Arthur standing beside a partially constructed wooden boat, his arm around a teenage boy whose features unmistakably resembled David. Grandfather and grandson captured in a moment of shared purpose, their expressions reflecting mutual respect and affection. The sight contradicted everything David had implied about their relationship, suggesting a connection far deeper than Emily had been led to believe. Before she could examine the photograph more closely, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed by the distinctive sound of splitting wood. The ceiling stain in the corner suddenly expanded as a section of roof gave way, sending a cascade of rainwater into the study. Alex reacted with startling efficiency, grabbing empty containers from beneath the sink to catch the worst of the deluge, while Emily moved valuable documents from the desk to safety. The immediate crisis highlighted their isolation. No cell service, no landline visible, no neighbors to call for assistance. Emily assessed the damage with growing concern. Without repairs, the breach would worsen, potentially compromising the structural integrity of the entire house. David had taught her basic construction principles during their home renovation years ago, knowledge that now seemed providential rather than merely practical. In the mudroom off the kitchen, Emily discovered an extensive collection of tools organized on pegboard walls, everything from basic hammers and saws to specialized woodworking implements whose purposes she could only guess at. Beside them hung waterproof tarps, coils of rope, and containers of various fasteners sorted by type and size. Arthur had maintained his workshop with the same precision evident throughout the property, each tool cleaned and oiled, positioned for maximum efficiency. With Alex's help, Emily gathered necessary supplies for temporary repairs. The boy displayed surprising knowledge, identifying specific tools and suggesting techniques he'd learned from books and videos. Working together as the howling storm, they positioned a ladder beneath the compromised section, Emily climbing carefully to secure a tarp across the damaged area while Alex handed up tools and offered encouragement. The repair wouldn't last indefinitely, but it would protect the house until proper materials could be obtained. The physical labor coupled with the stress of their journey left Emily exhausted. As they worked, however, she experienced an unexpected sensation, a kind of muscle memory awakening as her hands manipulated tools and materials. David had often remarked on her natural aptitude for practical tasks, an ability that seemed at odds with her profession's focus on abstract numbers. Now those dormant skills resurfaced when needed most, her body remembering what her conscious mind had filed away. While securing the final corner of the tarp, Emily's foot dislodged a ceiling panel, revealing a previously hidden access point to the attic. Curiosity overcoming fatigue, she extended the ladder and climbed through the opening, pulling herself into a vast, unfinished space beneath the main roof. Unlike the meticulously maintained rooms below, the attic appeared deliberately untouched for decades, a preservation of history rather than neglect. Dust motes danced in beams of light, penetrating through small ventilation windows as Emily moved carefully across ancient floorboards. Trunks and crates lined the walls, each labeled with years spanning from the 1940s through the early 2000s. At the center stood what appeared to be a partial boat skeleton, ribs and keel assembled, but unfinished, the wood aged to a honey-gold patina. Surrounding the structure, technical drawings had been pinned to support beams detailing innovative hull designs unlike conventional vessels. As Emily examined those plans, she noticed recurring references to maximum stability in Category 4 conditions and unsinkable compartmentalization based on 1912 analysis. Arthur had apparently been designing vessels specifically engineered to withstand catastrophic storm conditions, incorporating lessons from historic maritime disasters. The drawings displayed obsessive attention to safety features, many dated after what appeared to be a pivotal year, 1987, marked on several documents with a small black cross. Alex appeared through the attic entrance, his slight frame navigating the space with natural agility. Together, they discovered a locked sea chest positioned beside the unfinished boat frame. The brass key that had opened the front door fit this lock as well, revealing contents that shifted Emily's understanding of their situation entirely. Inside lay dozens of letters spanning decades, many bearing official government seals, detailed environmental impact studies of Lake Huron, newspaper clippings about development projects and suspicious boat accidents, and a leather-bound journal containing Arthur's personal records. The journal entries revealed a complex narrative. Arthur's son and daughter-in-law, David's parents, had died in a boating accident on Lake Huron in 1987. The official report ruled it weather-related, but Arthur had harbored suspicions about structural tampering after discovering unusual damage patterns inconsistent with storm impact. His investigations had led him to Blackwell Development Corporation, which had been pressuring lakefront property owners to sell during that period. Without conclusive proof, Arthur had channeled his grief into two parallel pursuits, designing unsinkable boats to prevent similar tragedies and documenting Blackwell's increasingly aggressive development tactics. The island, which had been in the Reynolds family for generations, became both sanctuary and watchtower, from which Arthur monitored environmental changes in the lake and gathered evidence against Blackwell's operations. Most disturbing were recent entries describing unusual water testing results near proposed Blackwell construction sites, elevated levels of industrial chemicals that shouldn't be present in Lake Huron's protected waters. Arthur had apparently been sending samples to independent laboratories, compiling data that suggested systematic environmental violations. His final entries mentioned photographic evidence hidden where only someone who understands water can find it. As Emily processed these revelations, Alex called her attention to something else entirely. A loose floorboard near the boat frame revealed by their movement through the dusty space. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment containing what appeared to be architectural plans for a massive dam and water diversion project bearing Blackwell Development letterhead. The designs marked confidential detailed structures that would fundamentally alter Lake Huron's water flow for private energy generation, potentially devastating natural habitats and traditional fishing grounds. Attached to these plans was a handwritten note in Arthur's distinctive script. This is what they really want the island for, the critical survey point. Without this property, they cannot complete the hydrological assessments needed for permits. The island wasn't merely an aesthetic acquisition for Blackwell's resort vision. It represented the final piece in an environmental exploitation scheme disguised as luxury development. The storm outside intensified as night fell, completely transforming the attic from mysterious archive to claustrophobic confinement. Emily and Alex descended to the main floor, bringing the most critical documents with them. In the kitchen, they found camping lanterns and emergency supplies organized for precisely such situations. Another indication of Arthur's meticulous preparation for their arrival. Using the wood stove that dominated the kitchen's far wall, Emily prepared a simple meal from pantry supplies. As they ate by lantern and light, the house creaking around them like a living entity, Alex's earlier excitement had transformed into thoughtful contemplation. He studied the compass they'd found on the boat, turning it slowly in his hands before asking the question that had clearly been forming since their arrival. Why had David never told them about this place, about his grandfather, about their family history on the island? Emily had no satisfactory answer. David had mentioned his grandfather only in passing, describing him as a solitary, difficult man who built boats for everyone but never a home for his family. The evidence surrounding them contradicted this characterization completely. The house, while utilitarian in some aspects, had been crafted with obvious care for its inhabitants' comfort and safety. Photographs throughout showed moments of family connection. Children's books still lined shelves in a small bedroom upstairs, preserved as though awaiting young visitors. Whatever rift had separated David from his grandfather remained unclear, though Emily suspected Blackwell's influence might have extended there as well. The developer had demonstrated remarkable skill at isolating Arthur from potential allies, perhaps including his own grandson. The thought that David might have reconciled with Arthur, might have brought Alex to this island under different circumstances, created an ache of lost possibility. Their conversation faded as exhaustion overcame them. Emily arranged sleeping bags near the wood stove, creating a warm nest against the storm's continued assault. Alex fell asleep almost immediately, his face relaxed in ways she hadn't seen since before David's death. Despite the day's revelations and uncertainties about what morning would bring, Emily felt an unexpected sense of security within these hand-built walls, as though the house itself stood guard over its new inhabitants. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and racing thoughts. Near dawn, Emily woke fully to absolute silence. The storm had passed, leaving preternatural stillness in its wake. She moved quietly to the front porch, opening the door to a transformed world. The island glistened under early light raindrops, clinging to pine needles and birch leaves like suspended glass. Lake Huron stretched to the horizon, its surface surprisingly calm after the night's turbulence, reflecting a sky gradually shifting from indigo to pale gold. For the first time since arriving, Emily could see the island's position relative to the mainland, more distant than she had realized during their chaotic crossing. From this elevation, she noted distinctive rock formations creating natural breakwaters and the protected cove where their boat remained secured. The property's strategic location became immediately apparent, commanding views in all directions. Naturally defensible approaches established landing points for different wind conditions. Arthur hadn't chosen this island randomly. Its geography served specific purposes beyond mere isolation. Movement on the water caught her attention. A sleek motorboat approaching from the direction of the mainland, its white hull gleaming against dark water. The craft moved with purpose, following a direct line toward the island rather than the safer marked channels visible on the navigation charts. Someone familiar with the underwater topography, then someone who had made this crossing before. As the boat drew closer, Emily recognized Frank Cooper at the helm, his distinctive captain's cap visible even at distance. He navigated the final approach with practiced ease, cutting the engine and gliding into the natural harbor formed by rock outcroppings. Within minutes, he had secured his vessel and was making his way up the path toward the house, carrying what appeared to be a toolbox and supply bag. Frank showed no surprise at finding Emily awake and waiting, merely nodding and greeting as he reached the porch. He had come to check on them after the storm, he explained, knowing how intimidating the old house could be during severe weather. His casual reference to previous visits confirmed Emily's suspicion that Frank had been maintaining the property since Arthur's death, perhaps for years before that as his health declined. Inside, Frank moved through the rooms with familiar confidence, checking for storm damage and noting the temporary roof repair with approving eyes. When Alex emerged sleepily from his nest of blankets, Frank greeted him with unexpected warmth, producing from his bag fresh bread and preserves from the mainland. And a traditional welcome gift, he explained, for the island's new caretakers. Over breakfast, Frank's manner shifted subtly from neighbor to advocate. Arthur had chosen Emily specifically, he revealed, not merely as David's widow, but because of qualities he had observed from a distance. Through occasional communications with David before their estrangement, Arthur had learned about Emily's background in financial forensics, her ethical stance against corporate clients, her practical capabilities. These attributes, combined with her status as Alex's mother, had made her the ideal guardian for both the island and the information it contained. The estrangement between Arthur and David, Frank explained reluctantly, had centered around Blackwell's influence. After David's parents died, Arthur had become consumed with investigating the accident, creating distance that Blackwell exploited. The developer had offered David significant architectural contracts, positioning himself as a mentor while systematically undermining Arthur's warnings as paranoid conspiracy theories. By the time David realized the manipulation, pride, and misunderstanding had calcified into silence, Arthur's attempts at reconciliation came too late, thwarted by illness and geography. This revelation struck Emily with physical force. The tragedy of miscommunication extending beyond death, opportunities for healing, permanently lost. David had never known the truth about his grandfather's motivations or his parents' deaths. He had never seen the evidence gathered in the attic, never understood the environmental battle being waged from this isolated outpost. Frank allowed them time to process this information before addressing more immediate concerns. Richard Blackwell, he warned, had intensified efforts to acquire the island since Arthur's death. Rumors circulated about permit applications already filed for development projects requiring island access. They should expect contacts soon, perhaps today, with offers designed to appear irresistible to someone in Emily's financial situation. As though summoned by this warning, the distinctive sound of an approaching motor broke the morning stillness, larger and more powerful than Frank's modest vessel. From the kitchen window, they watched a gleaming white yacht cut through the water, its hull at least 40 feet long, chrome fixtures glinting in the sunlight. Unlike Frank's respectful approach through established channels, this craft took the most direct route, demonstrating either ignorance of underwater hazards or confidence in superior technology to overcome them. The yacht anchored offshore, too large to navigate the narrow entrance to the protected cove. A smaller motorboat detached from its stern, carrying a single passenger toward the island. Even at distance, the man's appearance communicated wealth and authority. Silver hair, perfectly styled clothing, casual, yet obviously expensive movements, suggesting someone accustomed to compliance rather than resistance. Frank's expression hardened as he recognized the visitor. Richard Blackwell himself, not a representative, an unusual step indicating the situation's importance. Frank advised Emily to hear the man out, but commit to nothing. Arthur had accumulated leverage beyond the property itself. Understanding that position fully before negotiations would be crucial. As Blackwell's smaller craft approached the shore, Frank excused himself with unexpected urgency. There was something he needed to show them before the developer arrived, something Arthur had intended as their first true introduction to the island's secrets. He led them quickly through the house to what appeared to be a pantry off the kitchen. Pulling aside preserved goods, revealed a disguised door, its edges virtually invisible when closed. Beyond lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Frank produced a flashlight and illuminating stone steps worn smooth by decades of use. The passage angled downward through bedrock, emerging into a cathedral-like space, carved partly by nature, partly by human hands. A hidden boathouse connected to the lake via an underwater channel, large enough for small craft to enter unseen from the surface. The chamber's true purpose became immediately clear, a fully equipped boat-building workshop, where Arthur had continued his most important work away from prying eyes. Unlike the preserved historical displays in the main house, this space contained modern tools alongside traditional implements, a fusion of time-tested techniques and contemporary technology. Partially completed hull sections rested on specialized cradles, while design specifications covered workbenches and technical instruments occupied dedicated stations. Dominating the space was a vessel unlike any Emily had seen, approximately 25 feet long with the unusual hull configuration and equipment installations that suggested purposes beyond recreational sailing. Frank confirmed her assessment, Arthur's final project, a research vessel designed specifically for monitoring Lake Huron's ecological systems while withstanding extreme weather conditions. The boat incorporated revolutionary stability features, specialized sampling equipment, and sustainable propulsion systems that could operate silently for extended periods. What made the vessel truly remarkable, Frank explained, was its potential to document environmental violations that conventional monitoring couldn't detect. Arthur had designed specialized sensors capable of tracing chemical signatures to their sources, creating verifiable evidence of pollution impossible to dismiss through legal maneuvering. The completed boat would represent direct threat to Blackwell's operations, which explained why the developer had intensified efforts to acquire the island since Arthur's workshop assistant had leaked information about the project's existence. Frank directed their attention to a weathered steel cabinet against the far wall. Using the same brass key that had opened the house and sea chest, Emily revealed contents that shifted her understanding completely. Comprehensive financial records of Blackwell Development Corporation obtained through public filings and investor reports revealing a company facing significant debt and regulatory challenges. Arthur had been tracking Blackwell's increasingly desperate financial position alongside his environmental violations, information that explained the developer's accelerated timeline and aggressive tactics. Most significantly, the cabinet contained documentation of Arthur's legal preparations. The island had been placed under environmental conservation easements that prohibited development regardless of ownership changes. Blackwell could buy the property, but legal restrictions would prevent the construction necessary for his water diversion project. Arthur had effectively created a fortress of environmental protection with Emily as its designated guardian. Frank checked his watch with growing concern. Blackwell would have reached the main dock by now, expecting a greeting. They needed to return to the house immediately, presenting nothing but innocent curiosity about the unexpected visitor. The workshop's existence must remain secret until they fully understood the technical aspects of Arthur's final project and secured the evidence he had accumulated. As they hurried back through the hidden passage, Emily's mind raced with implications. She had arrived expecting to find a simple inheritance, perhaps a modest property to sell for financial security. Instead, she had stepped into an ongoing environmental defense spanning decades with her son's future and the lake's ecosystem hanging in the balance. What began as financial desperation had transformed into something far more consequential, a legacy of protection and purpose passed from one generation to the next through unexpected channels. The brass key felt heavier in her pocket as they emerged from the hidden doorway, carefully repositioning the pantry shelves to conceal its existence. Outside, they could hear footsteps on the porch, polished shoes against weathered boards, the sound of confidence accustomed to unopposed entrance. Richard Blackwell had arrived expecting to find a vulnerable widow, easily persuaded by financial necessity, unaware that beneath the island's surface lay revelations that transformed the encounter entirely. Emily straightened her shoulders, exchanging a meaningful glance with Frank before moving toward the door. The compass in Alex's pocket seemed to pulse with significance, a guide not just to physical navigation, but to the moral course ahead. Behind them, hidden from surface view, Arthur's final creation waited for completion. A vessel designed to weather storms, both natural and man-made, carrying truth forward when its creator no longer could. The morning light streamed through front windows, illuminating the threshold between past and future as Emily reached for the handle, ready to meet the man who had underestimated 3 generations of Reynolds' resolve. Richard Blackwell stood framed in the doorway, sunlight gleaming off his silver hair and designer watch. His carefully casual attire, linen pants and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent, contrasted sharply with the rustic surroundings. He extended his hand with practiced warmth, a smile that had closed countless deals spreading across his tanned face. "Emily Wilson, pleasure to meet you in person. My deepest condolences about Arthur's passing." He was quite a character around these parts. Blackwell's eyes swept past Emily to take in the house's interior cataloging details, with the assessment of someone mentally calculating property value rather than appreciating craftsmanship. Emily maintained a neutral expression while accepting the handshake, her financial analyst's instincts immediately recognizing the predatory evaluation beneath the cordial veneer. From the corner of her eye, she noted Frank's almost imperceptible headshake, a warning not to reveal their prior conversation or knowledge. "Thank you for the condolences, Mr. Blackwell. This is quite an unexpected visit." Blackwell's smile widened as Emily gestured him inside his confidence, suggesting he interpreted her polite response as potential receptiveness. Once settled in Arthur's living room, Blackwell choosing the largest chair as though it were a throne, the developer launched into a well-rehearsed monologue. He'd had tremendous respect for Arthur, despite their business disagreements. The old man's stubbornness had been legendary, his refusal to consider reasonable offers almost admirable in its way. But surely Emily, as a practical woman with a child to consider, would take a more sensible approach to the situation. Alex appeared in the doorway, observing the visitor with uncharacteristic intensity. The boy's usual shyness had vanished, replaced by something resembling Arthur's evaluating gaze from the photographs. Blackwell faltered momentarily before recovering with practiced charm, commenting on the strong family resemblance. A manipulation tactic Emily recognized immediately, establishing false familiarity to manufacture trust. Frank remained standing near the window, arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. The dynamic in the room shifted perceptibly, Blackwell's confident monologue giving way to more pointed inquiry about Emily's plans for the property. The isolation, the maintenance challenges, the impracticality for a single mother, all presented as concerns rather than pressure points, though the underlying message was unmistakable. When Blackwell finally named a figure, $700,000 cash offer, no inspection contingencies, closing within 30 days. Emily maintained her composure despite the sum exceeding her wildest expectations. The amount would eliminate their financial struggles instantly, providing security that had seemed impossible just days ago. Yet the eagerness behind the offer confirmed Frank's warnings. The island held value beyond its apparent worth. Rather than accepting or declining, Emily countered with genuine curiosity about Blackwell's development plans. The question momentarily disrupted his polished presentation, calculation flashing behind affable eyes. His response came wrapped in environmental buzzwords: sustainable luxury, minimal footprint, harmony with nature. Corporate jargon that Emily had encountered numerous times in her accounting career, typically masking less benevolent intentions. Frank shifted his weight, drawing Blackwell's attention. The developer's expression hardened momentarily before recovering its practiced congeniality. There seemed to be history between the men beyond their connection to Arthur, tension thickening the air as Blackwell redirected the conversation back to his offer's generous terms. Emily thanked him for his interest, but explained she needed time to consider all options. After all, she'd only just arrived and barely begun exploring the property. Disappointment flickered across Blackwell's face, quickly concealed behind understanding nods. Of course she should take a few days, though the offer couldn't remain open indefinitely. Market conditions, investor expectations, development timelines, business realities, creating artificial urgency. As Blackwell prepared to leave, he mentioned casually that his company had recently acquired the mortgage on her Chicago apartment building, and how fortunate that her eviction notice had arrived just as this inheritance opportunity presented itself, almost like the universe providing perfect timing. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them, Blackwell's eyes communicating what his words carefully avoided articulating directly. After watching Blackwell's boat disappear toward the mainland, Frank's posture relaxed visibly. The developer's interest in acquiring the island had intensified exactly as Arthur had predicted. The mention of Emily's Chicago apartment confirmed suspicions that Blackwell had been monitoring her financial vulnerability, positioning himself to exploit her desperation. The next morning brought clarity and purpose. While Alex explored the shoreline under Frank's watchful guidance, Emily immersed herself in Arthur's records, applying her financial forensics background to the massive documentation. Hours dissolved as she correlated seemingly unrelated data points: property acquisitions, shell company formations, permit applications filed through different entities, but sharing common legal representatives. A pattern emerged revealing Blackwell's true objective: a massive hydroelectric project disguised as recreational development. The technical specifications hidden in Arthur's workshop detailed water diversion mechanisms requiring control of specific shoreline properties, with the island representing the keystone position that would make the entire scheme viable. More disturbing were Arthur's environmental impact projections. The proposed water flow alterations would devastate spawning grounds for endangered lake sturgeon, potentially collapsing populations already struggling from historical overfishing. Indigenous communities whose fishing rights were protected by treaty would lose critical food sources and cultural heritage. Wetlands filtering the watershed would face irreversible damage, affecting water quality throughout the region. Frank returned with Alex mid-afternoon, the boy clutching a collection of unusual stones and weathered glass fragments discovered along the northern shore. As Emily shared her findings, Frank's expression darkened. Arthur's suspicions had been correct, and more urgent than even he had realized. Recent boring samples from Blackwell's geologists suggested accelerated timeline for construction, potentially beginning within months if all properties were secured. Alex arranged his beach treasures on the kitchen table, creating a miniature map of the island's shoreline. The boy's geographical instincts had blossomed since their arrival, his natural affinity for spatial relationships finding expression in this environment. While the adults discussed Blackwell's plans, Alex studied Arthur's nautical charts with growing comprehension, occasionally asking questions that revealed surprising insight for his age. That evening, Frank introduced them to what he called island living skills, practical knowledge Arthur had considered essential for anyone residing there. He demonstrated the backup power systems, explained water collection procedures, identified edible plants growing in sheltered areas, and outlined basic boat maintenance requirements. Each lesson built upon Emily's existing capabilities while revealing how thoroughly Arthur had planned for self-sufficiency. The following days established a rhythm as they settled into island life. Mornings began with system checks and maintenance tasks, Emily's hands growing increasingly confident with tools and techniques. By afternoon, Frank would arrive bringing supplies and local news, often accompanied by other longtime residents, curious about the island's new occupants. Evenings were spent reviewing Arthur's records or working in the hidden workshop, the three of them gradually piecing together his vision for protecting the lake. Alex flourished in this environment, his previous withdrawal giving way to enthusiastic exploration. He formed an immediate bond with Frank, absorbing the older man's knowledge about boats navigation and lake ecology with remarkable retention. The boy, who had barely spoken after his father's death, now chattered excitedly about fish species, weather patterns, and boat design principles, his natural intelligence finding fertile ground in these practical applications. Emily discovered her own unexpected transformation. Financial spreadsheets had been replaced by technical diagrams, corporate boardrooms by workshop benches. She found satisfaction in physical tasks that produced tangible results. A repaired roof, a restored dock section, a refinished cabinet. Her analytical mind adapted quickly to new challenges, recognizing that Arthur's apparent eccentricities had actually been carefully calculated strategies for preserving both the island and the lake's ecosystem. Frank introduced them to the Anderson family, third-generation commercial fishermen whose livelihood depended on the lake's health. The Andersons had collaborated with Arthur for decades, their boats serving as inconspicuous platforms for monitoring water quality and fish populations. Sarah Anderson, the family's matriarch, remembered Arthur from her childhood and welcomed Emily with a warmth that suggested the continuation of long-standing alliance rather than new acquaintance. Through the Andersons, Emily connected with a network of lake defenders Arthur had cultivated. Environmental scientists collecting data, indigenous leaders protecting treaty rights, tourism operators dependent on natural resources, local officials concerned about corporate influence. Each relationship revealed another facet of Arthur's methodical resistance against Blackwell's ambitions. These connections proved invaluable when Emily discovered county notices for a public hearing regarding zoning changes around the lake, changes that would accommodate Blackwell's development plans while bypassing more rigorous environmental review. The hearing had been scheduled with minimal publicity buried in legal notices where affected residents would likely miss the announcement, a common tactic for controversial projects. Emily's financial background proved unexpectedly applicable to environmental advocacy. She organized the disparate community groups into a coordinated response, translating technical concerns into economic impact language that resonated with county commissioners. Her presentation at the public hearing, backed by data from Arthur's research and testimony from longtime residents, secured a postponement for further environmental assessment, a procedural victory that visibly unsettled Blackwell's representatives. The developer's response came swiftly. Unusual boat traffic appeared near the island vessels circling just outside territorial waters, occupants photographing the shoreline and structures. Supply deliveries were mysteriously delayed or canceled. Local businesses suddenly became reluctant to provide services, suggesting behind-the-scenes pressure. The Chicago eviction notice accelerated, demanding vacation within 15 days rather than the original 30. Most concerning were the regulatory challenges that materialized without warning. County inspectors appeared citing anonymous complaints about code violations in Arthur's house. Tax assessments were reviewed and adjusted upward. Permit requirements for the boat dock were discovered in previously unenforced ordinances. Each obstacle seemed designed to drain Emily's limited resources and erode her resolve. Frank weathered these tactics with grim familiarity. Blackwell had employed similar strategies against Arthur for years, escalating pressure until most would surrender. What made Emily different, what had likely attracted Arthur's attention from afar, was her professional experience with corporate intimidation techniques. Rather than becoming defensive, she documented each incident methodically, building a pattern of evidence suggesting coordinated harassment. The hidden workshop became their strategic headquarters. Emily's accounting precision complemented Frank's practical knowledge as they assessed Arthur's final project. The vessel was approximately 80% complete, lacking only specialized monitoring equipment and final hull sealing. Emily's background in forensic accounting proved surprisingly transferable to technical assembly, her attention to detail and pattern recognition, facilitating rapid learning of unfamiliar systems. Alex contributed unexpected value to their efforts. His smaller hands could reach compartments adults found inaccessible, his natural curiosity leading to discoveries they might have overlooked. Most significantly, the boy possessed intuitive understanding of Arthur's organizational logic, locating tools and components with uncanny accuracy, as though some genetic memory connected him to his great-grandfather's thought processes. While working in the workshop one afternoon, Alex discovered a hidden compartment beneath the main workbench. The space contained waterproof cases holding Arthur's most sensitive documentation, including photographs and technical readings from locations near Blackwell's existing properties. The evidence revealed consistent pattern of environmental violations, unauthorized dredging, improper waste disposal, habitat destruction beyond permitted boundaries. Most damning were water quality samples, showing chemical signatures matching proprietary compounds used in Blackwell's construction processes. Frank identified the collection as Arthur's insurance policy. Evidence gathered systematically over years documented with chain of custody protocols that would withstand legal challenges. The old boat builder had been preparing for eventual confrontation, accumulating verifiable proof of violations that could trigger regulatory penalties severe enough to derail Blackwell's financial structure. The final research vessel was designed to complete this documentation with irrefutable scientific precision. Their breakthrough was accompanied by escalating external pressure. Emily received formal notice that Blackwell Development had indeed purchased her Chicago apartment mortgage and was exercising acceleration clauses due to property condition concerns. Technical language masking, simple intimidation. The financial maneuver would require full payment within 30 days or face foreclosure, an impossible timeline under normal circumstances. That same evening, a severe storm system moved across Lake Huron. Meteorologists described it as unusual for the season, with wind patterns and precipitation levels exceeding historical averages. The island's weather monitoring equipment, another of Arthur's foresighted installations, registered barometric pressure drops, suggesting intensity beyond official forecasts. Emily, Alex, and Frank worked through early evening, preparing the property for impact, securing external structures, activating backup systems, positioning emergency equipment for accessibility. The storm hit with unexpected ferocity around midnight, transforming the lake into a churning cauldron of whitecaps visible by lightning flashes. Wind-driven rain infiltrated even the smallest gaps in the house's weatherproofing, creating streams that threatened Arthur's documentation and equipment. The main electrical system failed around 2 a.m. despite protective measures. Emergency generators activated automatically but struggled against the storm's intensity. In the basement workshop, water began seeping through the underground channel connecting to the lake, rising steadily toward irreplaceable equipment and documentation. Working by lantern light, they formed a human chain to move critical components to higher ground. Emily directed the effort with surprising authority, her corporate crisis management experience translating effectively to physical emergency. Alex demonstrated remarkable composure following instructions precisely while suggesting storage solutions that maximized limited dry space. Frank's decades of nautical experience informed their prioritization of equipment in documents, identifying which items could withstand moisture exposure and which required absolute protection. Around 3 a.m., a particularly violent gust compromised the workshop's eastern wall, where natural rock formation met human construction. The breach allowed significantly more water infiltration, threatening to overwhelm their containment efforts. As Emily struggled to position reinforcement materials against the damaged section, a portion of the adjacent rock face collapsed inward, narrowly missing her. The structural failure revealed a previously unknown recess in the natural caverns system. Within this hidden space secured in waterproof military-grade containers, they discovered Arthur's most closely guarded possessions, original engineering specifications for Blackwell's water diversion project, obtained through means the old man had deemed too risky to document, geological surveys contradicting Blackwell's public environmental impact statements, and most significantly, photographic evidence linking Blackwell personally to the boat sabotage that had killed David's parents. This final revelation hit Emily with physical force. The accident that had orphaned David separated him from his grandfather and fundamentally altered the family's trajectory had been deliberately orchestrated to eliminate obstacles to Blackwell's earliest development plans. Arthur had known or suspected this truth for decades, but lacked sufficient evidence for legal action, a burden that explained his increasing isolation and seeming paranoia. The storm's intensity peaked near dawn, leaving them exhausted but successful in protecting the workshop's essential components. As morning light filtered through the remaining storm clouds, they assessed the damage, significant but repairable structural impacts, temporarily compromised water systems, minor loss of secondary documentation. More importantly, they had discovered Arthur's complete case against Blackwell. Evidence compiled over 30 years awaiting only the final scientific confirmation that the specialized vessel would provide. When Emily finally collapsed into brief sleep mid-morning, her dreams were vivid landscapes of intersecting patterns, financial spreadsheets transforming into lake currents, corporate organizational charts flowing into watershed maps, profit projections dissolving into environmental impact data. Her unconscious mind integrated these seemingly disparate systems, revealing connections her waking analysis had missed. She awakened with clarity that Blackwell's entire business model depended on regulatory exemptions that the evidence they discovered could immediately invalidate. The storm's aftermath brought unexpected opportunity. Regional news coverage of the unusually severe weather included reports of damage at several Blackwell construction sites, with particular focus on containment failures that had released construction chemicals into the watershed. Environmental officials were conducting preliminary testing, creating perfect context for introducing Arthur's historical documentation of similar previous incidents. Frank arrived midday with reports from the mainland. The storm had caused significant damage throughout the region, but most concerning were multiple failures of Blackwell's erosion control systems at active construction sites. Local fishing communities were reporting unusual water discoloration and dead fish washing ashore near these locations. County officials had requested state environmental assistance, creating increased regulatory presence throughout the area. Using Frank's boat for transportation, Emily visited the Regional Environmental Protection Agency field office, established for storm response. Rather than presenting accusations, she offered Arthur's historical water quality data as baseline reference to assist their current assessment. The approach positioned her as helpful resource rather than antagonist, allowing the documentation to enter official consideration without triggering immediate defensive reactions from Blackwell's legal team. The strategy proved effective. Agency scientists recognized the value of Arthur's methodical historical recordings, particularly his meticulous documentation of sampling protocols and chain of custody procedures. The patterns these records established created context for interpreting current conditions, strengthening regulatory authority for more extensive investigation. Without making direct accusations, Emily had effectively placed Blackwell's operations under enhanced scrutiny at precisely their most vulnerable moment. Returning to the island, Emily found Alex and Frank in the workshop completing temporary repairs to the damaged wall section. The boy had developed surprising competence with basic tools, his movements displaying growing confidence and proprietary connection to the space. While they worked, Alex asked questions about his father's relationship with Arthur, seeking to understand the family history he'd never been told. Frank's responses were honest but carefully framed, acknowledging the estrangement without assigning blame, emphasizing instead the manipulative external forces that had exploited natural family tensions. That evening, Emily organized their cumulative findings, applying corporate forensic techniques to environmental evidence. The synthesized timeline revealed Blackwell's decades-long strategy, acquiring key properties through legitimate purchase or pressured sales, establishing seemingly separate development projects without revealing their interconnection, utilizing political relationships to minimize regulatory oversight, and maintaining public environmental commitments contradicted by operational reality. Most significantly, Emily identified Blackwell Development's financial vulnerability. The company had leveraged existing properties to finance new acquisitions, creating a precarious structure dependent on continuous expansion. Recent projects had experienced cost overruns and completion delays, straining cash reserves. The hydroelectric component represented not merely profit opportunity, but financial necessity. Without its projected revenue, the entire corporate structure faced potential collapse. This analysis explained Blackwell's increasingly aggressive tactics toward the island. Traditional patience had given way to urgency bordering on desperation. Emily recognized the pattern from corporate fraud investigations she'd conducted. The acceleration of risky behavior when fundamental business models begin failing, creating vulnerability precisely when caution should prevail. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. Sarah Anderson and her son Michael arriving by their fishing boat concerned by unusual water readings near their traditional grounds. The instruments Arthur had provided years earlier showed chemical compositions similar to previous Blackwell-related contamination events, but at significantly higher concentrations. They sought Emily's guidance, implicitly acknowledging her as Arthur's legitimate successor in their environmental alliance. Emily hesitated, conscious of the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. She had arrived on the island seeking only financial resolution to immediate problems. Now local families were looking to her for leadership in continuing Arthur's protective mission, a role she had neither sought nor prepared for. The expectation felt overwhelming until she noticed Alex's expression. Pride mixed with certainty that his mother would rise to this challenge, just as she had faced every difficulty since David's death. Together with the Andersons, they developed a coordinated monitoring approach. The commercial fishing boats would collect water samples along their normal routes, providing broad coverage without attracting attention. Emily would continue engaging with regulatory officials, establishing herself as helpful resource rather than activist, allowing the evidence to create its own case without appearing personally motivated against Blackwell. Frank contributed critical historical perspective, explaining how Arthur had maintained community respect despite his increasing reclusiveness. The old boatbuilder had never sought confrontation for its own sake, instead focusing on documentation and strategic alliance building. His approach had been protection rather than opposition, preserving the lake's integrity rather than merely defeating Blackwell's ambitions. This distinction would prove crucial for maintaining broad community support. While these strategies developed and Emily and Frank resumed work on Arthur's specialized vessel, the boat's completion represented both practical resource and symbolic continuity, tangible evidence that Arthur's protective mission would continue through his chosen successors. The remaining technical challenges required creative problem-solving, with Emily adapting financial analytical approaches to engineering contexts, discovering unexpected applicability between seemingly unrelated disciplines. Alex continued his own development, dividing time between assisting with boat construction and exploring the island's natural features. His discoveries often proved surprisingly relevant. Natural water filtration systems Arthur had incorporated into the property's design strategic plantings that prevented erosion while supporting native wildlife observation points, providing unobstructed views of critical lake sections. The boys' natural affinity for these systems suggested genetic memory transcending the generational disconnection Blackwell had exploited. Their progress accelerated until interrupted by mechanical failure in the workshop's ventilation system, releasing metal-cutting fumes that forced temporary evacuation. While Frank repaired the equipment, Emily and Alex explored the island's highest point, a rocky outcropping offering panoramic views of Lake Huron stretching to the horizon. The perspective transformed their understanding of the island's strategic position, revealing sightlines to key mainland locations, including Blackwell's primary construction sites. From this elevation, they observed unusual activity at the lake's southwestern section. Multiple Blackwell vessels were conducting what appeared to be unauthorized dredging operations, taking advantage of reduced regulatory presence as officials focused on storm damage assessment elsewhere. Emily documented the activity, with Arthur's high-powered spotting scope capturing images, showing equipment types and locations clearly violating permit restrictions. Their observation was interrupted by distant mechanical sounds from the island's far shore, an area they had not yet fully explored. Following the noise source, they discovered a small cove where a weather-beaten aluminum boat had landed. Two men in Blackwell Development uniforms were photographing the island's features and taking soil samples near the shoreline, their presence clearly unauthorized trespassing on private property. Emily confronted the intruders, her corporate negotiation experience manifesting as controlled authority rather than confrontational aggression. When the men claimed they were conducting routine environmental monitoring, Emily countered with detailed knowledge of permit requirements and property boundaries, strategically revealing legal expertise that suggested potential consequences for their unauthorized presence. The combination of confidence and specific regulatory knowledge prompted their hasty departure, though not before Emily photographed their boat registration numbers and company identification. The incident confirmed Blackwell's desperation was escalating toward potentially illegal tactics. Emily contacted the county sheriff's office to report the trespassing, establishing official record, without specifically accusing Blackwell, allowing authorities to make connections independently while positioning herself as law-abiding property owner rather than adversary. The approach maintained her strategic advantage while creating protective documentation should confrontation escalate further. Returning to the workshop, they found Frank completing repairs while monitoring marine radio channels. The communications revealed intensifying conflict between Blackwell's operation and local fishing vessels, with commercial fishermen reporting equipment damage from unmarked underwater obstructions near construction areas. The pattern suggested deliberate interference rather than accidental encounters, another escalation targeting traditional lake users who might oppose development plans. This targeting of the Anderson family and other generational fishing operations shifted Emily's approach from defensive documentation to active intervention. Arthur's records included detailed underwater maps identifying historical fishing grounds protected by tribal treaties and federal regulations. These maps directly contradicted Blackwell's permit applications claiming minimal impact on commercial fishing areas. Discrepancies Emily highlighted in communications with regulatory officials now investigating storm damage. While compiling these materials for regulatory submission, Emily discovered financial statements suggesting Blackwell had significantly overextended his resources acquiring properties and political influence. The developer's aggressive timeline reflected not merely ambition, but necessity. Without the hydroelectric project's projected revenue, his entire corporate structure faced collapse within 18 months. This vulnerability explained his increasingly desperate tactics while providing strategic advantage for those opposing his plans. Their efforts gained unexpected momentum when regional media reported unusual fish die-offs near Blackwell construction sites affected by storm damage. The coverage prompted expanded regulatory testing that correlated with Arthur's historical documentation, creating official confirmation of contamination patterns the old Boatbuilder had tracked for decades. The public narrative began shifting from eccentric recluse to vindicated whistleblower. Exactly the perception shift Arthur had been working toward when death interrupted his efforts. Blackwell's response came through official channels rather than direct confrontation. County officials suddenly discovered permit irregularities with Arthur's boathouse construction, claiming structural elements never properly authorized despite standing unchallenged for decades. The transparent attempt at bureaucratic harassment instead created opportunity for Emily to demonstrate Arthur's meticulous compliance. His records included every permit inspection report and regulatory correspondence dating back to original construction, revealing current challenges as clearly retaliatory rather than legitimate enforcement. This bureaucratic victory strengthened Emily's position with local officials, many of whom had quietly respected Arthur, while publicly maintaining neutrality. Her professional approach and comprehensive documentation offered these officials pathway to enforce regulations without appearing politically motivated, protecting the lake through proper process rather than activist confrontation. The strategy isolated Blackwell by removing his narrative of reasonable development versus emotional environmentalists. Frank observed this shifting dynamic with satisfaction tinged with concern. Emily had mastered Arthur's strategic approach with remarkable speed, effectively countering Blackwell's tactics while building community alliance. Yet the developer had historically responded to public setbacks with private escalation. When legitimate channels failed, his methods had occasionally crossed into territory Arthur had documented, but never publicly revealed, fearing legal repercussions without absolute proof. This concern manifested reality sooner than anticipated. Returning from a meeting with environmental officials, Emily found the island's main dock damaged by what appeared to be boat collision. The structural impact precisely targeted connection points Arthur had reinforced specifically to prevent weather damage, suggesting deliberate targeting rather than accidental contact. No witnesses had observed the incident, and no responsible party came forward. Exactly the pattern Arthur had documented with similar accidents affecting other property owners who opposed Blackwell's plans. The incident crystallized Emily's understanding of what Arthur had faced for decades: continual pressure designed to exhaust resources and resolve, forcing capitulation through accumulated strain rather than single confrontation. The realization transformed her approach from reactive defense to proactive strategy, applying corporate forensic techniques to environmental advocacy. Instead of merely documenting violations, she began predicting Blackwell's likely next moves based on historical patterns, positioning countermeasures before pressure points could be exploited. This strategic shift coincided with important progress in the workshop. Frank's technical expertise, combined with Emily's project management approach, had resolved the vessel's remaining mechanical challenges. The specialized monitoring equipment, heart of Arthur's evidence-gathering system, required only final calibration and waterproof installation. After decades of development and construction, the boat was weeks rather than months from operational completion. The nearness to completion seemed to trigger heightened adversarial response. Unusual boat traffic increased around the island, maintaining legal distance while establishing obvious surveillance. Suppliers in town reported being approached with significant financial incentives for information about island activities. Local officials mentioned receiving anonymous complaints about everything from building code violations to child welfare concerns regarding Alex's presence in a remote location. Most concerning was the notification Emily received from her bank. Blackwell Development had not only purchased her Chicago apartment mortgage, but had also acquired her personal loan obligations from 3 separate financial institutions. The consolidated debt provided potential foreclosure mechanisms if payments faced even minor delays, creating financial pressure point independent from the island property. The corporate maneuver demonstrated both determination and detailed investigation into her personal finances. This financial aggression crystallized Emily's strategic response. Instead of defending against each separate pressure, she synthesized Arthur's decades of documentation into comprehensive regulatory complaint submitted simultaneously to state environmental authorities, federal wildlife officials, and tribal representatives whose treaty rights were threatened. The approach activated multiple independent investigatory processes targeting different aspects of Blackwell's operations, creating accountability mechanisms beyond his established influence networks. The filing created immediate results. Regulatory inspectors appeared at active Blackwell construction sites, conducting tests and reviewing documentation with unprecedented thoroughness. Tribal representatives asserted treaty rights requiring consultation for projects affecting traditional fishing grounds. Media attention shifted from isolated incidents to pattern recognition, connecting previously reported violations into coherent narrative of environmental disregard. Blackwell's public response projected confidence, while operational reality revealed concern. Construction activities slowed at key locations, equipment relocated from areas facing closest scrutiny. Corporate representatives emphasized commitment to environmental standards while quietly contacting potential allies in regulatory positions. The observable shifts confirmed Emily's strategic assessment. The developer faced financial constraints requiring project completion even as regulatory pressure increased operational costs and timelines. This developing advantage was suddenly threatened by natural intervention. Weather forecasts identified major storm system approaching Lake Huron, potentially more severe than the previous event. Meteorologists noted unusual atmospheric conditions creating potential for record-breaking wind speeds and precipitation levels. Emergency management officials began preparation notifications for coastal communities throughout the region. The forecast created both danger and opportunity. Storm conditions would likely overwhelm containment systems at Blackwell construction sites, potentially releasing additional contaminants and creating measurable environmental impact. Simultaneously, extreme weather threatened the island itself, particularly the workshop with its irreplaceable evidence and nearly completed vessel. Their preparation decisions would determine whether Arthur's decades of work culminated in regulatory vindication or literal submersion. Frank advocated completing minimal vessel systems to achieve emergency functionality, sacrificing advanced monitoring capabilities for basic operational capacity that could survive storm conditions. The approach would require intensive effort, but might preserve Arthur's most important contribution before natural forces compromise the workshop. With less than 36 hours before projected storm arrival, Emily made the difficult decision to attempt the accelerated completion plan. Working through the night, they focused on essential systems while documenting compromises for future correction. Emily applied project management principles from her corporate experience, identifying critical path dependencies and resource allocation priorities. Frank's technical knowledge translated these frameworks into practical implementation, adapting available materials to meet functional requirements. Even Alex contributed meaningful assistance, his smaller size allowing access to confined installation spaces adults couldn't navigate. By morning, the vessel had achieved basic structural integrity and simplified propulsion capability. The specialized monitoring equipment remained incomplete, but protected within waterproof containers, preservable, even if the boat itself sustained damage. Most critically, they had reinforced the workshop's vulnerable sections, particularly the eastern wall damaged during the previous storm. As wind speeds increased and barometric pressure dropped, Emily received unexpected communication from the mainland. Regulatory testing had confirmed contamination, matching Arthur's historical documentation at multiple Blackwell construction sites. Officials had issued emergency work stoppage orders pending comprehensive environmental review. Exactly the outcome Arthur had sought for decades finally achieved through the combined impact of his meticulous records and Emily's strategic implementation. The regulatory victory arrived simultaneously with the storm's leading edge. Rain began lashing the island with increasing intensity as wind gusts bent tree trunks to alarming angles. Emily secured final workshop preparations while Frank moved his boat to the protected underground cavern, the structure's design preventing wave action from reaching vessels within. Alex completed his assigned responsibilities with the focused determination that had increasingly defined his island persona, his movements reflecting confidence rather than fear, despite the intensifying conditions. As they completed final preparations, marina radio channels reported Blackwell's yacht attempting to return to mainland harbor ahead of deteriorating conditions. The vessel had departed his primary construction site carrying what dock workers described as boxes of papers, likely removing potentially damaging documentation before regulatory inspectors could require its production. The yacht's course would bring it within 2 miles of the island, traversing some of the lake's most challenging navigation during rapidly developing storm conditions. Emily watched the approaching storm front through the workshop's reinforced observation window, sensing convergence of natural power and human conflict reaching simultaneous crescendo. The island represented final barrier between Blackwell's ambition and environmental catastrophe, exactly as Arthur had positioned it through decades of patient resistance. Whether this barrier would hold against both corporate determination and nature's fury remained uncertain as darkness descended over Lake Huron's increasingly violent surface. The storm transformed Lake Huron into a wilderness of water and wind waves building to heights that erased the boundary between lake and sky. Inside the workshop, Emily monitored the emergency radio frequencies, catching fragmented reports of evacuations along the mainland shore. The barometer continued its precipitous drop, confirming what meteorologists were now calling a once-in-a-century weather event, a designation that had become disturbingly frequent in recent years. Frank studied the workshop's structural reinforcements, making final adjustments to the bracing system they'd installed. His weathered face betrayed neither fear nor uncertainty, only the focused concentration of someone who had prepared for this moment through decades of lake experience. Sometimes a storm shows you what things are really made of. Applies to boats, buildings, and people too. His eyes shifted meaningfully toward Alex, who was methodically checking the vessel's emergency systems according to the checklist Emily had created. The boy had undergone remarkable transformation during their weeks on the island. His movements displayed confidence that had been absent in Chicago. His questions reflected engagement rather than withdrawal. The environment Arthur had created seemed to activate something dormant in his great-grandson, a genetic resonance transcending their missed connection. Alex looked up from his task, catching Emily's gaze, his expression communicating capability beyond his years. "I've triple-checked everything, Mom. The bilge pumps are working, and the emergency transponder is ready if we need it." A sudden crackle from the marine radio interrupted their preparations. Distress calls from a vessel caught in the storm's accelerating fury, its position approximately 2 miles offshore. The transmission broke repeatedly, static overwhelming portions of the communication, but three critical pieces of information emerged clearly. The vessel was Blackwell's yacht. It had lost engine power after taking on water, and it carried 5 people, including Blackwell himself. Emily exchanged glances with Frank, the implications immediately clear. The Coast Guard station was reporting 30-minute response time due to multiple simultaneous emergencies across the region. Blackwell's vessel would likely capsize or be driven onto shoals within that time frame. The only craft close enough for potential rescue was Arthur's vessel, structurally sound but with untested systems and minimal operational verification. "Are we actually considering this?" Emily's voice tight with disbelief as she processed the situation's irony. The man had spent decades attempting to destroy everything Arthur had built, had potentially been responsible for David's parents' deaths, had threatened her financially and legally, and now his survival might depend on Arthur's final creation. Frank's expression remained neutral, years of lake wisdom evident in his measured response. Arthur built boats to save lives, didn't much care whose. That's what separated him from Blackwell all along. The statement cut through Emily's hesitation, crystallizing the fundamental value difference between developer and defender. Arthur's opposition to Blackwell had never been personally motivated. It had always been about protection rather than retribution. The decision crystallized with unexpected clarity. They would attempt rescue using Arthur's vessel, not to save Blackwell specifically, but because that's what the boat had been designed to accomplish. The specialized environmental monitoring systems remained incomplete, but the vessel's core architecture had been engineered precisely for operation in extreme conditions. If Arthur's design principles were sound, the boat would function exactly when conventional craft could not. Preparation accelerated with urgent precision. Frank's decades of nautical experience guided rapid final assembly of critical systems. Emily applied crisis management protocols from her corporate background, establishing clear responsibility allocations and communication procedures. Even Alex contributed meaningful assistance, his smaller frame accessing confined spaces to secure connections adults couldn't reach. Within 20 minutes, they had achieved minimum operational readiness. Moving the vessel from workshop to water presented the next challenge. The underground channel provided protected passage to the lake, but operating the ancient manual launch system required coordinated effort under storm conditions. Frank positioned himself at the control station, while Emily and Alex managed guidelines preventing the hull from contacting channel walls during descent. The mechanism functioned exactly as designed, further validation of Arthur's engineering foresight. As the boat settled into water, its behavior immediately demonstrated exceptional stability. Despite violent surface conditions within the protected channel, the specialized hull design minimized rolling and pitching, maintaining horizontal orientation that would be impossible for conventional vessels of similar size. Frank activated the hybrid propulsion system, relieved to find the electric motors responding with surprising power and precision. Arthur's integration of traditional wooden boat construction with advanced propulsion technology had created something unique, a vessel honoring historical craftsmanship while incorporating contemporary capabilities. Emily secured Alex in the boat's protected cabin, the boy's protests overridden by her insistence on reasonable safety measures. Though he had demonstrated remarkable capability throughout their island experience, rescue operations in storm conditions remained beyond appropriate risk parameters. Alex reluctantly accepted his assigned role, monitoring communication systems and tracking Blackwell's vessel location via emergency transponder signals. Navigating from protected harbor to open lake created immediate sensory assault. Wind-driven rain reduced visibility to mere yards. Waves towered over the vessel's bow, and directional orientation became virtually impossible through conventional means. Frank relied instead on Arthur's specialized navigation system, a combination of enhanced radar depth sensors and magnetic anomaly detection designed specifically for operation during extreme Great Lakes conditions. The vessel's performance validated Arthur's decades of design refinement. Where conventional boats would struggle against wave action, this hull configuration channeled water energy into stabilization rather than disruption. The specialized propulsion system maintained thrust despite variable submersion, providing consistent forward progress, where standard motors would cavitate uselessly. Most impressively, the structural integrity remained uncompromised, despite forces that would stress conventional vessels beyond safety margins. Through combined technical capability and human determination, they located Blackwell's yacht approximately 15 minutes after departure. The luxury vessel presented stark contrast to their own craft. Its sleek, modern design now brutally exposed as inadequate for actual lake conditions. The yacht listed dramatically to portward, its bow repeatedly submerging beneath oncoming waves, exterior features visibly damaged from water impact. 5 figures clung to the partially submerged stern deck, their survival increasingly improbable as structural failure progressed. Approaching the damaged yacht required navigating cross-current wave patterns that threatened to drive both vessels into collision. Frank demonstrated masterful control utilizing Arthur's unique hull characteristics to maintain position alongside the larger craft without entanglement risk. The rescue maneuver would require precise timing, creating momentary alignment between vessels during synchronous wave action, allowing transfer between craft during brief stability windows. From the yacht's stern, Richard Blackwell stared at their approaching vessel, with expression transitioning from desperate hope to confused recognition. The developer's immaculate appearance had dissolved completely. Designer clothing soaked and torn, carefully maintained, silver hair plastered against his skull, blood trickling from impact laceration across his forehead. Beside him huddled his personal assistant, 2 security personnel, and the yacht's captain, all similarly battered by storm conditions. Blackwell's voice barely carried above howling wind. Arthur's boat, impossible. That old man never finished anything worth a damn. The desperate situation had stripped away his carefully maintained corporate facade, revealing the raw contempt that had always existed beneath professional veneer. Even facing death, his fundamental character remained unchanged, evaluating Arthur's creation through lens of monetary value rather than human purpose. Emily positioned herself at the recovery station Frank had established, securing safety lines while preparing to assist survivors transferring between vessels. Getting them on board is the only priority right now. Everything else waits until we're back on land. Her voice carried professional calm developed through corporate crisis management, compartmentalizing emotional response to focus entirely on immediate tactical requirements. The transfer operation required multiple attempts as wave action repeatedly disrupted alignment between vessels. Frank maintained remarkable control of Arthur's boat, demonstrating the design's exceptional maneuverability despite violent conditions. One by one, the yacht's occupants made desperate lunges across the gap, Emily securing each arrival while Frank continuously adjusted position to accommodate changing weight distribution. Blackwell himself was last to transfer, his hesitation visibly extending beyond normal caution. Stepping onto Arthur's creation represented conceptual surrender more significant than physical survival, acknowledging that his opponent's values and methods had ultimately proven superior to his own. When wave action finally forced his decision, the developer crossed between vessels with awkward desperation that completely contradicted his usual calculated precision. As Blackwell collapsed onto the deck, a tremendous cracking sound announced the yacht's structural failure. The vessel broke apart with shocking suddenness, expensive components dissolving into the churning water, millions in luxury investment disappearing beneath Lake Huron's surface within minutes. The destruction's totality seemed almost deliberately symbolic. Nature's complete rejection of artificial value systems disconnected from environmental reality. With all survivors secured, Frank navigated back toward the island using Arthur's specialized guidance systems. The return journey revealed even more severe storm conditions, waves now exceeding 20 feet with unpredictable formation patterns. Conventional vessels would have become completely uncontrollable in such environment, yet Arthur's design maintained fundamental stability despite extreme forces, the culmination of decades spent studying Lake Huron's most challenging behaviors. Inside the cabin, Blackwell and his companions huddled in stunned silence, the developer's expression cycling between relief, confusion, and calculation as he observed the vessel's performance. Emily recognized the assessment occurring behind his eyes. Reevaluation of Arthur's capabilities and resources based on this demonstration of technical superiority. Blackwell's fundamental nature remained unchanged despite his brush with mortality. He was already reformulating strategy rather than reconsidering values. The return to the island's protected harbor proceeded without further complications, Arthur's vessel performing flawlessly throughout the operation. As they secured the boat within the underground boathouse, Emily observed Alex's expression, pride mixed with vindication, as though his great-grandfather's reputation had been personally important to him, despite their never having met. The boy had witnessed Arthur's creation fulfilling exactly its intended purpose, validating both the design principles and underlying values that had guided its development. Medical assessment revealed minor injuries among the rescued group, lacerations, contusions, and mild hypothermia, but nothing life-threatening. Emily established temporary accommodation in the main house's front rooms, maintaining professional detachment while providing necessary care. Blackwell watched her movements with analytical intensity, his entrepreneurial mind visibly processing new information about the property's capabilities and Emily's unexpected competence within this environment. As storm conditions continued unabated outside, an uneasy coexistence developed within the island house. Blackwell's security personnel maintained protective positioning despite their dependent status, while his assistant attempted establishing communication with mainland resources despite unavailable signals. The yacht's captain withdrew into technical assessment of their survival, professionally analyzing Arthur's vessel design with growing respect for its unconventional solutions to fundamental challenges. Blackwell himself alternated between imperious demands and calculated charm, attempting to establish dominance within a situation that had completely undermined his usual power dynamics. When initial attempts at control proved ineffective, he shifted toward information gathering, asking seemingly casual questions designed to assess the island's full capabilities and Emily's actual knowledge regarding his operations. The transparent manipulation confirmed Emily's corporate experience with similar executives, crisis revealing authentic character rather than triggering genuine reflection. By evening, the storm had established sustained intensity that meteorologists were now describing as potentially record-breaking for the region. Emergency broadcasts reported widespread power outages, coastal flooding, and infrastructure damage across multiple communities. The island's self-sufficient systems continued functioning without disruption. Arthur's decades of preparation proving remarkably prescient as conventional resources failed throughout the surrounding area. In this environment of forced proximity, conversations inevitably developed beyond immediate survival concerns. Blackwell, perhaps recognizing opportunity to establish rapport, began sharing development vision in terms carefully framed as environmentally beneficial. His description presented luxury construction as habitat improvement, water diversion as flow optimization, and commercial exploitation as economic salvation for struggling communities. The narrative displayed polished persuasiveness that had likely convinced countless investors and officials throughout his career. Emily allowed the presentation without direct challenge, her analytical mind cataloging factual discrepancies between Blackwell's claims and Arthur's documentation. The developer's charismatic delivery confirmed how effectively he had manipulated public perception throughout decades of environmentally destructive projects, creating narratives so superficially reasonable that opposing it appeared obstructionist rather than protective. This rhetorical skill had likely contributed significantly to the isolation Arthur had experienced during his resistance efforts. As Blackwell concluded his promotional monologue, Frank entered from perimeter inspection, his weathered appearance contrasting sharply with the developer's calculated polish, despite recent ordeal. The old boatbuilder listened briefly before offering devastating simplicity. Pretty words don't change what water does when you move it where it doesn't belong. I've watched this lake longer than you've been building things beside it. Nature doesn't negotiate terms. It just shows you where you're wrong, usually when it's too late to fix. The statement's unvarnished truth silenced Blackwell momentarily, decades of marketing language neutralized by experiential wisdom. Emily recognized the fundamental difference between their perspectives. Blackwell viewed the natural environment as resource to be optimized for human benefit, while Arthur and Frank understood themselves as participants within systems requiring fundamental respect. This philosophical division explained why compromise had proven impossible despite decades of apparent conflict over mere property rights. Alex, who had been quietly observing the exchange from his position near the radio equipment, unexpectedly contributed perspective that surprised both Blackwell and Emily. Sometimes in math problems you think you've got the right answer because your calculation works out. But if you use the wrong formula to begin with, getting clean numbers doesn't make you right, it just makes you consistently wrong. The boy's natural insight crystallized the fundamental flaw in Blackwell's approach: internally consistent logic built upon fundamentally incorrect premises. Blackwell's expression shifted between dismissal and reassessment as he studied Alex more carefully, perhaps recognizing intellectual capacity beyond expected for his age. The developer attempted redirecting conversation toward Emily's future plans for the island, his questions carefully structured to identify potential financial pressure points or development opportunities she might consider under different circumstances. The transparent manipulation technique might have been effective with someone lacking Emily's corporate background, but her experience with similar negotiation tactics provided immediate recognition of his strategic positioning. Rather than defensive response, Emily redirected discussion toward immediate survival priorities, establishing watch rotation, managing resource consumption, and maintaining communication monitoring. The practical focus neutralized Blackwell's conversational advantages while emphasizing the island's self-sufficiency under Arthur's design principles. Without directly challenging the developer's fundamental values, she demonstrated their comparative inadequacy within current circumstances, a more effective counter-argument than direct confrontation. As night deepened and storm intensity maintained undiminished force, Emily established sleeping arrangements that strategically separated Blackwell's group while maintaining awareness of their movements. Trust remained impossible given their fundamental conflict and the developer's demonstrated willingness to employ questionable tactics. Frank volunteered for First Watch, his decades of maritime experience making him naturally attuned to environmental changes that might require immediate response. During her scheduled rest period, Emily reviewed Arthur's documentation regarding Blackwell's operations, correlating historical patterns with recent observations. The comprehensive records revealed consistent methodology across decades of development projects: initial presentation as community, economic enhancement, strategic division of local interests through selective benefits, regulatory compliance on visible metrics, while violating restrictions in less monitored areas, and systematic pressure against opposing voices through financial and legal mechanisms. Most significantly, Arthur had documented Blackwell's fundamental business vulnerability: operational dependency on continuous expansion to service acquisition debt. Each development required subsequent larger project to maintain financial viability, creating acceleration pattern that inevitably exceeded environmental sustainability. The current hydroelectric initiative represented culmination of this unsustainable trajectory: maximum potential revenue, but with corresponding maximum environmental impact and regulatory exposure. This analysis crystallized Emily's strategic understanding. Blackwell's aggressive pursuit of the island transcended mere project completion. It represented existential necessity for his entire business model. Without the hydroelectric component, previous investments would become unserviceable liabilities rather than profitable assets. This desperation explained the increasingly extreme tactics while providing critical leverage for potential resolution. Blackwell needed specific outcome within limited time frame, creating negotiation vulnerability despite his apparent strength. Morning brought marginal storm reduction, still dangerous, but with decreased precipitation and moderate wind velocity reduction. Radio communications reported extensive damage throughout the region, with emergency services overwhelmed by simultaneous infrastructure failures across multiple communities. Recovery operations had begun in less affected areas, but significant portions of the lakefront remained inaccessible due to flooding and debris accumulation. Most significantly for their situation, Coast Guard communications indicated search operations for Blackwell had been initiated following automated distress signals from his yacht. The developer's importance within regional economic and political structures had prioritized his recovery despite competing emergency demands. Rescue vessels were systematically searching the yacht's last known coordinates, but remained unaware of the successful evacuation to the island. This information created strategic decision point for Emily. Notifying authorities would relieve immediate responsibility for Blackwell's group, but would also introduce external complications before she had fully leveraged their current situation. The developer's presence on the island, directly experiencing both Arthur's foresight and the storm's validation of his environmental concerns, created unique opportunity for potential resolution, impossible under normal circumstances. Frank supported delayed notification, recognizing the rare alignment of factors that might accomplish what Arthur had sought for decades. Blackwell's direct dependency on their resources temporarily suspended his usual power advantages, creating brief window where genuine communication might penetrate his typically impervious perspective. The approach carried ethical complexity but offered possibility for resolution beyond mere temporary victory in their specific conflict. Their discussion was interrupted by Alex's urgent summons to the radio equipment, where emergency broadcasts were reporting catastrophic failure of containment systems at Blackwell's primary construction site. The storm surge had overwhelmed temporary structures, releasing construction chemicals and sediment into previously unaffected watershed areas. Environmental officials were documenting significant fish mortality and contamination levels, exceeding regulatory thresholds by substantial margins. This development created immediate context shift. What had been Arthur's theoretical predictions about environmental risk were now demonstrable current events, with tangible consequences visible to regulatory authorities and public observers. The situation Arthur had spent decades attempting to prevent was now occurring in abbreviated form, a preview of potential permanent damage should the full project proceed as designed. Blackwell received this information with carefully controlled expression that nevertheless revealed genuine concern beneath practiced corporate composure. The developer immediately attempted establishing communication with his operational team, seeking damage assessment and reputation management rather than environmental remediation. This response further confirmed his fundamental priorities. Financial exposure representing greater threat than ecological damage in his assessment hierarchy. Emily recognized opportunity within crisis. The containment failures precisely matched Arthur's predictive models, validating his technical analysis while environmental impacts were still theoretically reversible. This limited demonstration could potentially accomplish what decades of abstract warnings had failed to achieve: concrete evidence of actual, rather than theoretical consequences, visible to both regulatory authorities and public stakeholders. When Blackwell demanded immediate transport to the mainland, despite lingering dangerous conditions, Emily countered with alternative proposition. Rather than risking additional human safety, they could utilize Arthur's vessel for limited inspection operation, documenting actual conditions while remaining within reasonable safety parameters. The approach would provide Blackwell direct observation of impacts while demonstrating Arthur's boat functioning in exactly its designed capacity. Environmental monitoring under challenging conditions. The developer's hesitation revealed conflicting priorities: urgent damage control requirements versus justified safety concerns regarding Arthur's experimental vessel. Emily leveraged this uncertainty by systematically addressing his unstated objections, presenting operational evidence from the rescue mission, while emphasizing the boat's specific design parameters for the exact conditions they would encounter. The approach employed corporate persuasion techniques familiar from her professional background, anticipating objections while presenting risk-mitigated solution paths. Ultimately, pragmatism overcame skepticism. With communication systems still compromised and conventional transportation unavailable, Arthur's vessel represented the only viable option for direct situation assessment. Blackwell reluctantly accepted the proposal, though his security personnel maintained obvious vigilance, reflecting continued distrust despite their dependent position. Preparation for the monitoring operation progressed with efficient coordination. Frank and Emily completed final system checks, while Alex established documentation protocols for environmental observations. The vessel's specialized monitoring equipment, previously incomplete during rescue operations, now received accelerated final connection, enabling limited functionality for its originally intended purpose. Arthur's design would finally fulfill its complete mission, demonstrating environmental impacts while operating under the extreme conditions that enabled their occurrence. Departure from the island's protected harbor revealed significantly improved but still challenging lake conditions. Wave height had decreased to approximately 8 feet, wind velocity maintained at 30 knots with occasional stronger gusts, and precipitation had transitioned from driving rain to intermittent showers. Arthur's vessel handled these conditions with remarkable stability, further demonstrating the design's exceptional capabilities compared to conventional craft that would remain harbor-bound under similar circumstances. Frank navigated toward Blackwell's primary construction site, following carefully calculated route that balanced direct approach against wave pattern management. The vessel's performance drew reluctant admiration from the yacht's captain. His professional assessment recognizing technical innovations that transcended traditional design limitations. Even Blackwell himself appeared impressed, despite efforts to maintain critical perspective, his entrepreneurial mind perhaps calculating potential commercialization opportunities rather than appreciating the underlying philosophy that had guided Arthur's development process. As they approached the construction zone, environmental impacts became immediately visible, even without specialized monitoring equipment. Construction barriers had catastrophically failed, releasing settlement containment ponds into the watershed. Floating debris created navigation hazards throughout the area, while chemical sheens displayed distinctive patterns across water surfaces. Most dramatically significant fish mortality was evident along contamination boundaries, floating evidence of impacts that would extend throughout the food chain. Blackwell observed these conditions with increasingly troubled expression, perhaps finally confronting physical manifestation of consequences previously dismissed as theoretical concerns. The developer's typical response patterns, dismissive qualification, responsibility, deflection, and remediation minimization, seemed inadequate against the visual evidence surrounding their vessel. Arthur's specialized sensors provided additional impact quantification, measuring contaminant concentrations and dispersal patterns that would significantly complicate regulatory compliance claims. Their documentation operation attracted attention from emergency response vessels now operating in the area. Coast Guard communications expressed surprise at their presence in the exclusion zone, particularly upon identifying Blackwell himself aboard the unregistered vessel. Emily managed these interactions with professional precision, explaining their assessment mission, while coordinating information sharing that positioned them as valuable resource rather than unauthorized intruders. Throughout these exchanges, Blackwell remained uncharacteristically subdued. His attention focused on tablet displays showing real-time environmental readings from Arthur's monitoring systems. The comprehensive data collection capacity, precisely tracking contaminant migration patterns, chemical interaction effects, and projected dispersion timelines, represented exactly the independent verification capability he had consistently opposed through regulatory influence. Seeing this capacity deployed specifically around his project created undeniable demonstration of accountability, mechanisms he had successfully avoided for decades. As they completed their documentation circuit, Frank guided the vessel toward a small cove area northwest of the main construction zone. This location, seemingly unremarkable compared to the dramatic damage elsewhere, held specific significance evident in Arthur's navigational markers. Here, specialized sensors detected distinctive chemical signatures matching effluent from Blackwell's processing systems, but dating from 3 years earlier. Physical evidence confirming long-term pattern rather than isolated storm-related incident. Emily referenced Arthur's historical documentation demonstrating correlation between previous, unexplained fish population declines and construction activities officially reported as fully compliant with environmental regulations. The pattern established deliberate rather than accidental violations, systematic exploitation of monitoring limitations and enforcement gaps rather than occasional operational failures. This narrative of transformation from isolated incident to documented pattern fundamentally altered potential regulatory and legal consequences. Blackwell's assistant monitoring communications from regulatory agencies reported escalating governmental response to the containment failures. Multiple environmental protection departments had initiated coordinated investigation with federal authorities now involved due to potential Clean Water Act violations. Regional media had begun comprehensive coverage, emphasizing unusual contamination extent compared to companies' previous compliance claims. Most concerning from Blackwell's perspective, investment analysts had issued preliminary warnings about potential liability exposure exceeding insurance coverage parameters. The combined impact of direct observation and escalating external response visibly affected Blackwell's calculated confidence. The developer's typical crisis management approach, controlling information while deploying legal resources against potential liability, had been compromised by comprehensive documentation and multi-agency involvement. For perhaps the first time in his career, containment appeared impossible through conventional methods that had previously proven effective. As they returned toward the island, navigation alerts reported another weather system approaching the region, less intense than previous storm, but still potentially dangerous given infrastructure damage and compromised emergency response capabilities. This development created natural deadline for their temporary situation, requiring resolution before conditions deteriorated or beyond safe transportation parameters. The impending weather front accelerated decision timelines for all involved. Blackwell needed mainland access to implement damage control measures protecting his broader business interests. Emily required a commitment regarding the island's future protection before surrendering her temporary leverage. Frank prioritized securing Arthur's vessel and documentation before conditions deteriorated. These converging necessities created natural negotiation framework where mutual benefit required collaborative rather than competitive approach. Inside the workshop, Emily presented Blackwell with comprehensive analysis Arthur had developed over decades. The material demonstrated fundamental flaws in the hydroelectric proposal, not merely environmental impacts, but engineering limitations, geological constraints, and financial projections based on unrealistic operational assumptions. Most significantly, the documentation identified alternative approaches that could accomplish energy generation goals through distributed systems without requiring centralized water control mechanisms. While Blackwell initially dismissed these assessments as amateur analysis, the detailed engineering specifications contradicted his dismissal. Arthur's background in naval architecture had provided foundation for remarkably sophisticated hydrological modeling, identifying failure scenarios that Blackwell's consultants had either overlooked or deliberately minimized. The containment breaches they had just documented matched these predictions with uncomfortable precision, suggesting similar accuracy in longer-term projections. The accumulated evidence created a decision point for the developer. His current approach faced escalating challenges: regulatory investigations with potential criminal implications, investor confidence deterioration affecting financing, availability, and public relations damage, extending beyond this specific project to his broader operations. These compounding factors threaten not merely the hydroelectric initiative, but potentially his entire business structure, given its leveraged financial foundation. Emily presented alternative resolution framework. Rather than continuing adversarial approach, Blackwell could reposition as environmental innovation leader by adopting modified development approach, incorporating Arthur's sustainable design principles. The island would remain protected conservation area, while alternative energy generation methods could proceed on mainland properties already under development. This approach offered face-saving transition while avoiding catastrophic regulatory and financial consequences of continuing the current strategy. The proposal leveraged Emily's corporate background in strategic restructuring, offering Blackwell pathway from potentially ruinous confrontation toward modified success that preserved core business objectives while abandoning specific methodologies. By emphasizing financial and reputational benefits rather than environmental values, she addressed his fundamental motivations while achieving Arthur's protective goals through pragmatic rather than ideological approach. Blackwell's response reflected genuine decisional struggle rather than tactical calculation. The developer had built his identity around particular operational methodology that Arthur's alternative directly challenged. Accepting different approach meant acknowledging fundamental flaws in his established practices, psychological barrier potentially more significant than specific project adaptation. His expression cycled through recognizable stages of defensive response: dismissal, qualification, condescension, and finally reluctant consideration as pragmatic assessment overrode emotional resistance. When weather alerts announced accelerated timeline for the approaching front, practical necessities forced decision point. Blackwell requested private communication with mainland associates using satellite phone Frank had retrieved from emergency supplies. The conversation occurred beyond Emily's hearing, but the developer's expression upon return suggested significant strategic reassessment. Resignation combined with calculation indicating compromise acceptance with likely intention for reputation-preserving implementation approach. The agreement framework developed with surprising efficiency once Blackwell committed to directional change. Emily would provide comprehensive access to Arthur's research supporting alternative energy approaches. Blackwell would withdraw hydroelectric permit applications while announcing innovative partnership developing distributed generation systems. The island would receive permanent conservation easement, preventing future development regardless of ownership changes. Financial terms included structured payment program, replacing immediate cash transaction, reducing Blackwell's immediate liquidity requirements, while ensuring Emily's long-term security. Legal documentation necessarily remained preliminary given their isolation, but recorded verbal agreement established enforceable commitment sufficient for immediate operational decisions. Most significantly, Blackwell authorized immediate containment and remediation measures for the storm damage. Critical environmental intervention that would demonstrate good faith while potentially mitigating regulatory consequences from the documented violations. As improved weather window developed, Coast Guard communication confirmed availability for evacuation operation from the island. Blackwell and his group would return to the mainland for emergency response management, while Emily, Alex, and Frank would remain to secure the property against the approaching weather system. This separation created natural transition from their forced coexistence while establishing operational framework for their new collaborative approach. Before departure, Blackwell paused for final assessment of Arthur's workshop, the space representing decades of opposition that had ultimately proven more visionary than obstructionist. The developer's expression suggested complex reevaluation rather than simple capitulation. Perhaps recognizing alternative innovation path he might have pursued had competitive positioning not overshadowed actual problem-solving in his operational approach. Without explicit acknowledgement, his attention to specific design elements indicated professional respect that transcended their adversarial history. Watching the Coast Guard vessel depart with Blackwell aboard Emily experienced unexpected emotional complexity. Their conflict resolution lacked satisfying villainous defeat narrative. No dramatic confrontation or humiliating surrender, merely pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances by someone fundamentally unchanged in core values. The outcome aligned with Arthur's apparent approach throughout his documented history, prioritizing effective protection over personal vindication, results over righteous satisfaction. As they secured the property against the approaching weather front, Frank shared perspective that contextualizing their experience. Arthur never expected to defeat Blackwell, just outlast him long enough for truth to become undeniable. Some things you can't argue people into seeing. They have to watch the water themselves to understand how it really works. The observation captured Arthur's patient strategy across decades, creating documentation foundation that would eventually validate his concerns when conditions inevitably demonstrated his predictions' accuracy. The workshop's protection became their primary focus, securing Arthur's research and the vessel that represented his design philosophy's culmination. Alex contributed increasingly confident assistance, his movements displaying familiarity with the space and equipment that seemed impossibly developed given their limited time on the island. The boy's connection to his great-grandfather's work transcended their missed personal relationship, suggesting continuation pathway that would extend beyond Emily's generation. That evening, as strengthening winds announced the approaching weather system, Emily discovered final communication Arthur had prepared before his death. Hidden within the vessel's navigation compartment, sealed letter addressed to whoever continues contained perspective rather than instructions, reflection on protection's fundamental nature and purpose. The handwriting showed physical weakness, but maintained mental clarity, characteristic of his documented thinking throughout decades of isolated advocacy. The letter's contents offered neither dramatic revelations nor sentimental closure, instead providing philosophical foundation for the protection work Emily had unexpectedly inherited. True legacy isn't what you prevent from happening, it's what you make possible instead. Anyone can oppose destruction. Harder task is building something better while you're doing it. Arthur's perspective transcended simple environmental preservation, extending toward creative alternative that respected natural systems while acknowledging human development needs. Opposition transformed into innovation rather than mere resistance. As Emily read these words aloud to Alex and Frank, the approaching storm front arrived with moderate intensity that seemed almost gentle compared to their previous experience. Arthur's preparations proved equally effective against this system, the property's design accommodating environmental forces through integration rather than opposition, physical manifestation of the philosophical approach articulated in his final communication. Their shared understanding crystallized around this central insight Arthur had spent decades creating rather than merely defending, developing boat designs that worked with water dynamics rather than against them, establishing island systems that enhanced natural processes rather than controlling them, documenting environmental interactions that revealed opportunity within constraint. His opposition to Blackwell had never been the purpose, merely necessary component of larger creative vision that could now potentially advance through collaboration rather than conflict. 18 months later, the island hosted gathering that would have seemed impossible during Arthur's lifetime. Environmental officials, tribal representatives, sustainable development advocates, and educational institution delegates assembled to commemorate establishment of the Reynolds Center for Great Lakes Innovation, research and education facility, expanding Arthur's workshop into comprehensive resource for developing technologies aligned with natural systems rather than imposed upon them. Emily guided visitors through the expanded facilities, her professional background now fully integrated with environmental advocacy through leadership position, bridging technical development and practical implementation. The former financial analyst had discovered unexpected application for her skills within sustainability context. Economic models validating protection approaches through demonstrated value creation rather than merely regulatory compliance. Frank maintained active involvement despite advancing age, his practical knowledge providing essential grounding for technical innovations emerging from the research programs. The old Boatbuilder had found renewed purpose, transferring traditional craft knowledge to younger practitioners, ensuring Arthur's design philosophy continuation through direct mentorship rather than merely preserved documentation. Most remarkably transformed was Alex, now 12, and developing confidence that transcended his earlier withdrawal. The boy had established natural leadership role among visiting student groups, translating complex environmental concepts into accessible demonstrations that reflected his great-grandfather's practical communication approach. His personal workshop space within the larger facility contained design projects combining Arthur's traditional techniques with computational modeling approaches, generational knowledge transfer, creating evolution rather than mere preservation. Richard Blackwell attended the ceremony with carefully maintained professional demeanor, his public position substantially reconstructed through strategic repositioning as sustainable development advocate. Though fundamentally unchanged in core motivations, the developer had discovered profitable application for modified approaches incorporating environmental considerations as market advantage rather than regulatory burden. His participation represented pragmatic adaptation rather than values transformation, yet the practical outcomes aligned with protection goals despite motivation differences. The gathering's centerpiece was Arthur's completed vessel, now officially commissioned as research platform, supporting environmental monitoring throughout Lake Huron. The boat's innovative design had proven remarkably effective during subsequent storm events, validating Arthur's engineering principles, while gathering critical data, documenting both violation impacts and recovery patterns. The vessel represented perfect synthesis of traditional craftsmanship with contemporary purpose, honoring historical knowledge while serving future protection needs. As institutional representatives completed their formal remarks, Emily found moment for private reflection at the island's northern point. The promontory offered expansive view across Lake Huron's vastness, perspective that Arthur had likely sought during his decades of solitary advocacy. Storm clouds gathered on the distant horizon, not threatening but reminder of natural forces that ultimately transcended human management, regardless of technological sophistication or financial resources. The bronze memorial plaque beside her captured Arthur's philosophy in simple inscription that Emily had carefully selected from his extensive documentation. Water always finds its true path eventually. Wisdom is building with that knowledge rather than against it. On the sentiment applied equally to lake currents' human development and personal journey. Recognition that alignment with fundamental truths ultimately proves more effective than resistance against them, regardless of temporary advantages force might seem to provide. Alex joined her at the overlook, his height now reaching her shoulder, growing into his heritage both physically and intellectually. The boy studied the approaching weather system with Arthur's evaluative gaze, assessing patterns with natural understanding developed through direct experience rather than abstract education. Emily recognized in her son the qualities Arthur had somehow identified from distance, the capacity to see systems holistically while maintaining practical engagement with their components. Together, they watched the first research vessel departure from the newly established center. Arthur's boat navigating purposefully into the lake it had been designed to protect and understand. The craft's wooden hull embodied continuity between traditional knowledge and contemporary application, its specialized monitoring equipment extending human perception beyond conventional limitations. The vessel represented everything Arthur had valued, craftsmanship dedicated to protection technology, serving understanding rather than exploitation, human capability aligned with natural systems rather than imposed upon them. From this elevation, Emily could observe the broader transformation extending beyond their specific property. Blackwell's modified development projects now incorporated distributed energy systems rather than centralized control mechanisms, reducing environmental impact while maintaining economic viability. Restoration efforts had substantially mitigated storm damage impacts with monitoring, showing encouraging recovery in affected areas. Regulatory frameworks had evolved to address previously unrecognized vulnerabilities exposed through the documented violations. Most significantly, the adversarial positioning that had dominated environmental discourse throughout the region had begun shifting toward collaborative problem-solving approaches. Arthur's accumulated research, previously dismissed as activist obstruction, now provided foundation for development methodologies that incorporated natural system requirements as design parameters rather than regulatory constraints. The transformation remained incomplete and imperfect, yet demonstrated meaningful progress beyond previous conflict patterns that had produced primarily defensive protection rather than creative alternative. As environmental center activities continued behind them, Emily placed her arm around Alex's shoulders, feeling simultaneous connection to past and future generations. Arthur's vision had transcended his lifetime, finding continuation through unexpected channels and evolving beyond his specific implementation while maintaining core principles. The true legacy existed not merely in protected shoreline or preserved documentation, but in transformed understanding that would guide decisions beyond their immediate circumstances or location. What began as desperate financial salvation had become purposeful continuation. Emily's accounting background, finding application in sustainability economics. Alex's developing capabilities, finding expression in environmental engineering. Frank's traditional knowledge finding transmission to new practitioners. Arthur's isolated advocacy had transformed into collaborative innovation center, expanding protection from defensive preservation toward creative alternative development. The approaching storm front brought gentle rain rather than destructive force, nourishing rather than threatening the systems they sought to protect. Emily and Alex remained at the overlook, watching Arthur's boat navigate confidently through increasing wave action, its design working harmoniously with water dynamics rather than against them. The vessel represented everything protection truly required: understanding natural systems, designing with their requirements, and maintaining commitment beyond immediate challenges toward enduring relationship between human capability and environmental necessity.